So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and especially a good late evening to our speaker. To all of you, ladies and gentlemen, in here, out there, wherever, whenever you are viewing this webinar, and welcome to this, the 9th of the Maritime Security Challenges webinars. So I'm absolutely delighted to have everyone on board this evening, as we've got quite a treat for you. We have a webinar on an issue that is occurring at this very moment across the world, and we've got one of the premier speakers on this matter. So I hope it will turn into a very interesting discussion. Thanks have to go, of course, to the people and companies that make this discussion possible. So they include Lockheed Martin, NDA, and General Dynamics. So a big thanks to them, to recognizing the value of these sessions, to the Royal Canadian Navy, and to our naval and maritime friends and partners from around the world. And conversations such as these are key in expanding knowledge and understanding of these issues affecting not just the maritime, but the global domain. So I have the great pleasure this afternoon in my area of the world of having Captain Jeff Hutchinson as our moderator for this webinar. So Captain Hutchinson joined the Canadian Armed Forces in June of 1991, and after completing his schooling at the Canadian Royal Military College and his basic naval officer training, he transferred to the East Coast and served as a deck officer in HMCS Halifax. After receiving his Operations Room Officer's qualification, he moved to the left coast here and served as Weapons and then Combat Officer in HMCS Vancouver. His command appointments began as Executive Officer of Calgary and then of Algonquin, and in January of 2016, he was appointed Commanding Officer of HMCS Winnipeg, who I'd like to note is currently off in the Indo-Pacific right now, and I hopefully will be a key part of the conversation this afternoon. And Captain Hutchinson also deployed in company with HMCS Ottawa to the Indo-Pacific in 2017 to conduct exercises with the US Navy, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, the Royal Australian Navy, the Chilean Navy, and the South Korean Navy, as well as PASEXs with the Indian and Sri Lankan Navy. So he has a fantastic wealth of operational and area experience there. And it's because of this that I'm delighted to have him moderate the seminar. I'm sure between his operational expertise and our speaker's deep knowledge, we're going to have a very stimulating discussion. So Captain Hutchinson, the floor is yours, sir.
Thanks so much, Brett. You know, a really great opportunity today to leverage one of the, I would say, the world's experts on Indo-Asia-Pacific maritime security matters. Dr. Patalano, Alessio, thanks so much for joining us today. I'll take the opportunity to introduce you, and then I'll go into a couple points I think that are very pertinent to framing what we're going to talk about today. So Dr. Patalano, a full professor of War and Strategy at King's College London, where he specializes in maritime strategy and doctrine, Japanese military history and strategy, and East Asian security. Has taught at the Italian Naval War College in Venice, at the UK Joint Command and Staff College, at Shrivenham, and the Japanese Maritime Command and Staff College. In addition to being the author of books such as Post-War Japan as a Sea Power and Maritime Strategy and Naval Innovation in an Age of Competition with James Russell, he also writes in publications such as War on the Rocks, which I do quite enjoy, for wider audiences, and his August article there entitled "Why is a British Carrier Strike Group Heading to the Indo-Pacific" served as a catalyst for today's webinar. We're very fortunate to have you, Alessio, with us today. Your experience is in high demand with other events, and you were just speaking to one that you were engaged with over the last few days. And specifically, just the fourth session of the Center for Strategic and International Studies South China Sea Conference this last week. So welcome, Alessio. Greatly looking forward to your thoughts on the Queen Elizabeth deployment and its implications for the Indo-Pacific region. Now, from a moderator point of view, a nuts and bolts point of view, if you have questions, when they do occur to you, we'd ask you to put them into the chat, and what we'll do is collate them. And then when we get to the question and answer period, and there's Dan kind of giving the background chat version of what I'm saying right now, just put those questions in the chat, we'll collate them, and then I can pick and choose. I will not take my entitled moderator's right to questions until I feel it's absolutely necessary to do so. But a super interesting topic, one that I really think has implications for the world order. Let's just put it that way, in international relations. So I don't think that there will be any shortage of questions at all. So Alessio, if you're ready, I'd love to turn it over to you. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Captain Hutchinson, for the very generous introduction. I'm delighted to be back in a way, because I've been fortunate to participate to the Maritime Security Conferences organised by the Pacific Command of the Canadian Navy in the past, and it's always a pleasure to come back and engage in a conversation that is on a topic that we share an interest on with long-term friends and esteemed colleagues. What I want to do tonight is to sort of share with you, and I'll start sharing my screen in just a second. What I want to do tonight is just to sort of make some introductory remarks and try to give you my take as to why the UK is doing what it's doing with the deployment of CSG-21, the carrier strike group centered on the Queen Elizabeth carrier, but also place that into a broader context. Why it's happening now, and what does that mean insofar as the UK as a global international actor, and what's the meaning of this, and what also we can sort of expect after this deployment. Because I think the very important question around the deployment is it's doing a lot to show what the UK can do, but then the question is what's going to happen next. So really, my conversation with you tonight starts with these remains. Place the carrier into a broader context, explain what the context is and what's in it, why the UK is doing this, and sort of start setting the stage for what one could expect afterwards. So that hopefully we'll have enough on the plate for a meaningful conversation afterwards. So let me share the screen with you, and let me start off with a couple of preliminary observations. When we're talking about the return of the UK, really, I like the picture above. As you can see, that's a links on HMS Sutherland, and at the back you'll see there's a Japanese destroyer. That's a picture from April 2018, when the Royal Navy was the first navy, together with the JMSDF, to start implementing the latest UN sanctions on the ship-to-ship transfer or materials related to nuclear components in regards to North Korea. And that really was the first time that in 2018, the UK started sort of having a much more consistent and continuous presence in the Indo-Pacific. And also, incidentally, was the beginning of a conversation about what is the role that and how the UK, to what extent the UK should engage with this fast changing, fast evolving part of the world. And that is really like symbolically, I think, a very important starting point, because a question that really existed at the time was, will this really happen? This was the question when the first ships started to go down that part of the world. And I was meeting counterparts, colleagues, friends, and officials from across the region. The problem was not like, great, the British are coming in that sense, but it's like, will they stay? What does that mean? And so this idea of, will it happen at all? This sort of turning your attention towards the Indo-Pacific. was a question that really remained open until the sort of earlier part of 2021, but certainly already in 2020, there was an important debate that was taking place in Parliament that was animated by a series of statements made by senior officials from within the Johnson government that the UK was tilting towards the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific tilt, as it came to be known by the time that the Integrated Review, which is the current guiding principles of British foreign and security policy, sort of defined it, really sort of was the culminating point of this journey that had in 2018 the beginning of a clear indication that was starting to move towards a greater capacity and willingness to engage with the region, and really sort of set things in stone, as it were, in terms of, yes, the Indo-Pacific tilt is going to be very important. Now, this sort of preliminary observation leads to the three main, if you want, initial arguments that I want to throw out there, that I want to put on the table for our conversation, which really are essential to understand the meaning of CSG 21 as it is unfolding at the moment. One, a lot of the Indo-Pacific tilt, or the questions about the interest that the United Kingdom has started to have towards the region, has been sort of connected to Brexit, and in particular to the fact that by leaving the European Union, the UK would be forced to find new places, look at new, expand its horizons in that sense. However, that would be some sort of a rather reductive way to look at the interest and how the Indo-Pacific actually figures within British strategy and current, if you want, policy frameworks such as the Integrated Review. Brexit, as a result of that, really should be seen as part of this broader framework that is changing. It's one of the factors that contributed to cement that change, but certainly not a driver. This question of the Indo-Pacific as a region of the world that is becoming increasingly more central to international affairs, increasingly more central to both the geopolitical structural elements of international affairs by means of the sort of ever-increasing speed of the Sino-American competition, and also how international order and its different sort of ramifications from established contexts like the maritime order to new domain like cyber, space. It was becoming an increasingly central place where things were going to be shaped. So in that sense, Brexit sort of was a propelling factor, but certainly not a catalyst in itself. There was already a debate that was taking place, and so Brexit should be placed into that context. The second argument really is that the way for me to describe the Integrated Review core underwriting principles is really this return towards a maritime-centric strategy of almost Quebecian flavor, adapted to the 21st century, that explains how and why and to what extent the UK is envisioning its engagement with the region. And the third argument unfolded from this, that specifically what we should be thinking about when we try to understand the significance of CSG 21 and what's going to happen afterwards, is really this idea that had already started to be crafted within the Chief of Defence Staff Integrating Operating Concept announced in 2020, and then further elaborated in the command paper published shortly after the Integrated Review, which de facto was the implementation paper produced by the Ministry of Defence specifically on how to implement the content of the Integrated Review. Within that context, the idea, insofar as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, is that regardless of the amount of resources, like physical material resources that one can allocate to the region, the key is going to be around two notions. One, a more persistent form of engagement, one that is continuous and based on a regular sort of platform of engagement around core capabilities and treating peacetime activities not as a defense engagement set of actions, but rather as proper campaigns in which shaping the environment is absolutely central for the success of an open and stable Indo-Pacific region. So I'll take the last sort of few minutes of this initial part of the conversation to sort of give you a little bit of the idea. Why Brexit is part of a broader framework? Because there's three things that really needs to be considered that are very important in terms of understanding where the UK is coming from. First, the debate over the extent to which the UK should look beyond the Euro-Atlantic commitments as part of its national security considerations goes a long way back, at least since 2012, but certainly after 2015, in particular with the starting of the sort of winding down of the engagements in Afghanistan. This idea of being back east of Suez, although the British really never left east of Suez, started to become more important. Here, the key element was that being back east of Suez in the early 2010s really meant mostly the Gulf state region and part of the Western Indian Ocean. By the 2018 and 2020 sort of moment of the conversation, that had stretched down to the sort of northeastern Asian part of the broader Indo-Pacific space. Second, the engagement with the Indo-Pacific cannot be understood without accepting or familiarizing ourselves with the idea that the return on state and state competition as the key geopolitical challenge of the future as we look down to the time frame of the integrated review, which is 10 to 15 years, it's the sort of major geopolitical shift. And within that context, the Sino-American competition in the maritime spaces of the Indo-Pacific is a central component of this recognition. So for the UK, that presents a very important point, since the relationship with the United States remains a core pillar of British foreign and security policy. So engaging with the Indo-Pacific was no longer a matter of perhaps or whether we want to do it or not. It was now more of an imperative, and the question was really to identify how. And that how sort of brings about the third element of this framework, which is really where Brexit comes in, and is this reassessment of the UK as a global actor, which for a long time had been revolving around the role that the UK had in linking, sort of bridging the transatlantic divide and operating with European partners within Europe, within the broader reshaping of Europe as a geopolitical space. But again, in the aftermath of Brexit, really reconsidering the role of the UK in taking the withdrawal from the EU as an opportunity to start re-engaging with issues, themes, and parts of the world that have been less of a priority in a previous moment. Certainly because a lot of the attention and physical and material resources of the UK were focused so much on the European Union. Now, this is not the same as to say that the UK needed to withdraw from the EU in order to re-engage with the rest of the world. It is simply stating that in light of the results of the referendum over Brexit, the idea of moving out of the EU started to present an element of opportunity and proactive thinking into how to engage beyond the boundaries of the European political space. Why the Indo-Pacific matters? What is the sort of, where is this British strategy on the Indo-Pacific coming from? I think the 5 points that you can see here in this slide are very much sort of encapsulate in a short and quick way the considerations behind the idea of the tilt. And here, let me just say that the fact that in the integrated review, the idea was not to use words such as pivot, rather tilt. It's because the idea is a redistribution, is a recalibration. It's not a pivot, because the main and core focus of attention remains the Euro-Atlantic space, but it is nonetheless important to recognize that the Indo-Pacific is the epicenter of the 21st century power struggle. It is a primary theater for China as a revisionist political actor, the question of the international order and reshaping core elements in it, as well as a place where the modernization, the broader processes of modernization of military powers and capabilities sets it as a place where the notion of how military power serves the purposes of statecraft is being reviewed and reconsidered. But also the Indo-Pacific is a space in which there is a considerable number of partners and allies, and there are things from treaty obligation down to risks derived from the fact that this is a region that is risk-prone that demanded greater UK attention in this process of redefining its national sense of being. And again, the simple fact that the Indo-Pacific, because of the previous points, is really becoming a center of gravity in international affairs as such. So for a country like the UK that is member of the UN Security Council, that has a consistent sort of perception of self, that has to do with the global role, that idea of not engaging or an engagement that was just limited to specific aspects and not more comprehensive and therefore including matters of defense security would have been just not an option. In terms of the approach that strategy sort of brought about, the four sort of leading elements underwriting the Integrated Review are, of course, the support to allies and partners and meeting basic treaty obligations, from the residual commitments to the Korean War arrangement down to elements unfolding from the firepower defense arrangements and indeed the firepower structures. Of course, supported to the maritime order, given what the period between 2012 and 2020 had generated in terms of tensions and risks to that stability. And of course, from that, the idea that engaging with the Indo-Pacific, it's happening at a point in time in which, yes, there are tensions, but what is equally important is to shift from away from that reactive modality that had distinguished the years of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to one that focused a lot more about shaping maritime stability, as in notwithstanding number of crises and tensions that exist in the region at the structural level, at the regional level, there's still a lot that one can do in terms of capacity building, in terms of domain awareness, in terms of working with partners to inject both resilience and greater stability. And that really demanded a shift in posture from the reactive to the shaping modality. And within that context, in particular, working with allies and promoting different formats of multilateral security engagement was very much at the heart of how the UK tilt towards the Indo-Pacific is sort of was conceived and designed to take place. What does that sort of translate it into? And this is where the story becomes more important and the conversation about CSG21 starts becoming more intelligible. As we know from the command paper positions, the outlook for the Indo-Pacific posture for the British posture in the Indo-Pacific is likely to be centered on two OPVs of the River class batch 2 as of 2021, the forward deployment on a permanent basis of one of the two littoral strike groups centered on a Bay class support ship as of mid-2023 based in Dhaka in Oman, in addition to the naval station in Singapore, where Queen Elizabeth is right now at the moment, as well as other sort of outposts such as the Center for Jungle Warfare of the Gurkhas in Brunei. And then, of course, that sort of if you want, military, diplomatic, and political reshaping and sort of networking of all these different nodes scattered across the broader Indo-Pacific through the British Defence Staff reorganization that really sort of was meant to integrate the different components with an addition of a potential Type 31 frigate by the mid-2020s. And again, leveraging these positions around Brunei, Singapore, and Dhaka, potentially couple them up with reciprocal access agreements. And that, of course, in light of AUKUS, now presents some interesting sort of potential and possibilities, particularly in Australia. But of course, Japan remains an important also part of that conversation, as the Defense Secretary has confirmed very recently. So the posture would be very much leveraging relatively limited capabilities, but capabilities that are designed to operate in this shaping function, focusing on conducting activities as if they were peacetime campaigns, and maximizing different components of this toolbox by creating a better integration and networking of both the core nodes as well as the capabilities sort of positioned in them. One thing that I'd like to sort of point out is that the OPVs, this is HMS Tamer, one of the two OPVs that is currently already in the Pacific, having just passed, I think, the Panama Canal about a week and a half ago. HMS Tamer and Spey, as you can see here, they've been sort of given a new coat of paint with this dazzle camouflage, which was last used by the Royal Navy during World War II. And I think it's not just an opportunity to make a small ship to look cool. It's also, I think, an important statement of this idea of treating peacetime activities as campaigns. We all know that the constabulary space of the Eastern South China Seas, which are going to be the main spaces of operation for these assets, can be quite problematic, can be quite tensed. The idea of projecting something that last time was used during one of the most hard-fought campaigns in the history of the Royal Navy is about sending signals to the crews of these assets deployed on the region that the job they're going to be doing on a daily basis is going to be tough, is going to be serious, and it's going to be important, but also projecting to the type of customers of their activities, whether it is militias or naughty coast goods. It really is about making a statement that tactically makes the profile of the ship slightly less visible, but above all, it sort of makes stand out the fact that it might be small, but it's still a warship. So there is an element there of a statement both inwardly, if you want, and outwardly. And just to make the point even more clear, this is HMS 7, one of the ships that actually of the OPVs assigned to the North Atlantic. And as you can see, spots here a different type of camouflage. That's a camouflage still World War II, but it's a camouflage that was used for the Atlantic convoys. So really the point here is that there's been a lot of thought given to rebranding, if you want, these assets specifically to convey an important psychological message and a political signaling to both crews and intended audiences outwardly. And this leads really to the question of, so what is the role of CSG 21 within this context? CSG 21, it's a little bit like a big opening statement of what's to come next. In the sense that for the last 2 years, we know that since 2018, so 3 years now, the UK has had permanent deployments in the region. And so particularly from a maritime perspective, one of the most contested spaces or components of the security landscape in the region has been, and sort of at the center of many of the challenges, has been the one in which the UK has tried to engage much more significantly. Just to put things in perspective, The UK in 2018 with HMS Albion became the first country other than the United States to conduct a challenge of excessive maritime claims in the South China Sea, specifically around the Paracel Islands and the inappropriate application of strait baselines, and remains to present the only country to have done that within 12 nautical miles. So there has been sort of a significant attention to conceptualize a different messaging about the UK as a maritime power in that part of the world. And CSG 21 is taking that statement to the next level. Three things that I want you to consider in this respect. Number one, CSG 21 by its own composition speaks to one fundamental element of the UK Indo-Pacific tilt, and that is leveraging partnerships, working with close partners and allies. The composition of the task group includes a Dutch frigate, a US destroyer, and also, and particularly a combined air wing for HMS Queen Elizabeth, including US Marine Corps and British Armed Forces assets. Now, if you are very cynical, you could say that's because we couldn't have a full squadron based from UK assets. True. On the other hand, that also, and that is really the lesson, or if you want the point to take away, the capacity of the UK to mobilize an air wing, which is one of the most critical and absolutely pivotal components of the carrier strike group. It says a lot about how far and the new places where this idea of working with partners and allies, the UK is attempted to go. And showcasing this across the Indo-Pacific, and we've seen just 10 days ago with the multi-carrier exercise with the Japanese and the US, there is an absolute and genuine, not only appetite, but opportunity, however limited one's capabilities are, to actually bring those to maximum effect by developing higher levels of interoperability with partners and allies, something that at the moment in British doctrinal terminology is defined as interchangeability, and something that, to my mind, is one of the key statements that CSG 21 is doing. Of course, the second element, which we've seen also restated with AUKUS, with the AUKUS Defence Pact, is the fact that the carrier deployment is also about that recognition of state-on-state challenges and the shift in the geopolitical games, with a much more central role of hard power in maintaining a degree of stability. But at the same time, the third point about CSG 21 is how the group itself operated together, but also in a disaggregated fashion with different units conducting different type of activities that speak very much to this understanding of a robust peacetime approach to missions as part of a broader campaigns, whether it is to ensure good order at sea, maritime stability, or indeed push back on forms of coercion. You have these different layers built into. And I could use a number of examples from HMS Defender, working with the British Army in Brunei to how to delivering a part of the UK donation of COVID vaccines across Southeast Asia. I could talk about HMS Diamond interactions on the back of the Five Powers defense arrangements, or indeed HMS Richmond sailing through the Straits of Taiwan. The key point being that interchangeability and partnership, the role that hard power has in international relations and the comeback of the importance of that, as well as conducting activities not just because it's an act of presence, but it's an act of shaping the environment. These, I think, are the three most important points to take away from CSG 21. And interestingly enough, this is also how sort of CSG links the Euro-Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific context, because obviously the deployments in the Indo-Pacific came after the first leg in the Euro-Atlantic context, whereby the task group exercised within NATO with NATO partners as part of NATO activities. Elements like HMS Defender conducted challenges in other basins, in particular in the Black Sea. And so in that sense, it sticks to this, what I was mentioning at the beginning, this idea of Britain going back to a slightly more maritime core to its national strategy, in which being a global actor, it means taking advantage of the connectivity and access that the maritime domain provides in order to fulfill missions and activities in a broader context. So what are my conclusions? And I want to end here so that I'll stay within the 25, 26 minutes that I had planned to speak to you. There's 5 points really to take away, and some 5 final considerations for us to start off our conversation. In light of the integrated review, I think one can comfortably say that the Indo-Pacific is the space where global Britain is being defined in defense and security. Everything else was already there, but the tilt is really providing the addition of what and how the UK is trying to redefine is notion of a global medium power. Second, for the first time in more than 2 decades, defense debates are back to engaging questions of strategy rather than just operations. The debate over the tilt has been very much a debate about international geopolitics and the role of military power and hard capabilities in statecraft. And it's been really interesting and fascinating to see that debate in comparison to previous debates that focused very much on operational issues, on ongoing operations. A third point is the extent to which post-Brexit strategy will be one of shaping rather than reacting, and how this will depend on delivering new capabilities and elevating partner support. A lot of CSG is about a story that it's been implemented, but it's not finished. It depends on other capabilities being delivered, and above all, how one works with partners in order to achieve maximum effect. So part of the story there is really one that has to be written, and it will happen with the new capabilities being deployed in the region in part, and sort of starting working and implementing the content of the integrated review. The fourth point is that the focus of the tilt will remain maritime security and crisis response to consolidate the positive perception that CSG 21 has created, and in reality also the centrality of this domain. Maritime security is likely to remain a starting point of many conversations, not the only one, but a very important one, given the importance that maritime geopolitics have in the region in the broader sense. And UK strategy is likely to increase diversification through the US-UK relationship, with stronger military interoperability pursued across the region. And again, whether it is bilaterally with countries like Japan and India, and indeed Australia, or multilaterally, and AUKUS is a classic sort of like very good example of this. I should say that I was writing this a few weeks ago, so AUKUS kind of like is throwing a bit of a spanner in the work, because now it sounds less original than it was when I was writing it, but hey, at the same time, it's nice to have a confirmation in the making. But I think for the purpose of our conversation tonight with the Canadian audience, really this idea of diversifying partnership to address different aspects of that broader Indo-Pacific question is perhaps one of the most interesting elements of the conversation that one can and should carry on with long-term allies and close friends like Canada. On this happy note, I'll stop here, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you very much.
So Dr. Patalano, thanks very much for that. Lots to chew on. And, you know, there have been a number of questions asked in the background. I will say up front, having read them in advance, that I do not at all envy you, because some of them are fairly challenging. I'm going to start off with one, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. And I may actually add on to this, because there are a number of different ways that perhaps this could be looked at. The crux of the question is United Kingdom's deployment of power so far over the horizon, and particularly a CV and the associated strike group, the best use of its coordinated power? Would it not be more efficient for the UK to take the lead in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and perhaps leave coordination or leadership to the US Navy in the Indo-Pacific? And that's, depending on your answer to that, I could carry on with the second part.
Okay, so I mean, that's a terrific question, and it's a great opportunity to clarify 2 points. Number one, and I'll take them in reverse. I don't think what we're talking about in the Pacific, I don't think what I was describing there is an attempt at redefining leadership, but rather leveraging what the integrated review calls convening power, or the capacity to bring partners together and address the issues that are most pertinent to today's problems. And again, AUKUS is a classic example. The Australian Chief of Navy approached his counterparts in Britain for a conversation that would have been otherwise slightly more complicated to have directly with the United States. And then the UK National Security Council tried very hard to help coordinate meetings on the sidelines of the G7 Cornwall summit. And so I think what we are talking about with what the UK is trying to do is not to challenge American leadership or indeed to move away from or carve an element of leadership, but really sort of try to focus on what it can bring of its unique capabilities and participation to frameworks. The UK is now a dialogue member partner with ASEAN. Again, it is revitalizing the firepower defense arrangements. There are issues also about the security intended as more transactional level of security challenges, which can and should be addressed a lot more in the Commonwealth. So the UK here should be seen as a convening power rather than a leadership power, and the two are perfectly compatible. And this leads me to the first part of the question that was asked on focusing. This is not an either or. We cannot sort of talk as in like, oh, you know, you're doing the North Atlantic, it's fine. The Euro-Atlantic area is fine, because the rest of the world, someone else will look after. That's not the case. And by the way, it's never been the case. The UK, it's a small global power. It's a medium global power, as I call it, but it is a global power. It is also one of the very handful of countries that continues deterrence at sea, and it has done so for the last 6 or 7 decades. So in this respect, I completely agree with the assumption implicit in the question that the main focus should be the Euro-Atlantic area. And that goes without saying. The integrated review states that. And as I was saying, CSG first part of the leg outwards of the deployment was within NATO, working with NATO allies and doing working both in the Atlantic and in the Mediterranean. Having said so, the great advantage of being part of NATO is that within NATO, you have fantastic partners, and NATO's own efforts through the new warfighting capstone document, through a series of internal reforms, is starting to sort of work in a much greater coordinated and interchangeable fashion to set the foundation for countries like the UK to have the opportunity to work with NATO partners and beyond the boundaries. And put it this way, in the Mediterranean, it's not necessarily sort of to be said that the UK needs to lead from the front, because you've got countries like Italy, France, Spain, all extremely well equipped to address that. So in that sense, I think this is not an either or, it's a finding a balance between two important spaces. And at the moment, I think that the integrated review suggests an understanding of where the right balance is. That is a focus on the Euro-Atlantic and the rest is on top. But then again, capabilities, particularly maritime capabilities, are highly flexible, mobile. So one day they're operating with NATO, another day they're operating somewhere else. But if push comes to shove, of course, the priorities remain the Euro-Atlantic area. So great question, and thanks so much for asking that.
Yeah, and I think the good news is I think that you've addressed some of the other questions related to whether the United Kingdom placing some emphasis in the well, certainly right now, and the consistency that you've spoken to, what adjustments might be necessary on the part of NATO and in the North Atlantic because of it. The sub-question that we had, and I like your characterization of kind of a convening authority. If there is a certain focus on competition with China in the South China Sea or in the Western Pacific, is there not an opportunity here for the United States to take on, or to focus mainly on the convening role in the Northeast Asia with the Arab-KN JMSDF, and then perhaps for the UK to focus more in Southeast Asia? And if I can tie in another side question that I have here, are there any parts of Britain's colonial history in East Asia that would inhibit taking on that convening role, or overall that impact the tilt?
So, I mean, you touch upon two really important points. And again, I'm really pleased that someone asked a question about this. So on one hand, basically burden sharing, what we're talking about is burden sharing. And whether you do it regionally or you do it through particular type of topics, I think that is part of the conversation. That's why persistent engagement as an initial and opening statement becomes so important. Because once you have, if you want, extended some measure of commitment, then the next step is, okay, so how are we going to do this? And as I was saying, the emphasis really is going to be about shaping the maritime stability in that constabulary space to begin with. So whether that is applied to the Southeast Asian context, or the Western Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia, or indeed across the Indo-Pacific, it's part of the conversation to have with partners and allies. But I completely agree with the point in the question that this creates opportunities for regional actors, partners of the UK within that space, like the JMSDF, like the South Korean Navy, like the United States, to start thinking about, okay, someone is doing this job, how that empower us to reallocate, redistribute our own capabilities to address other issues. So in that sense, having the conversation, absolutely essential. And this leads to the second point, that is the point that I was making earlier about this is not coming overnight. This has been a long-term, long-standing conversation, and a lot of the reticence within the UK was in part due to this very question of the legacy of colonialism and empire. Because one thing you don't want to do is to willingly create discomfort within and among partners, countries that are sort of still members of the Commonwealth, create an environment that certainly feels like you're an imposition more than anything else. And so this is part of, and again, the example of ASEAN dialogue of partner states very much speaks to this long-standing conversation inside the UK and between the UK and a number of partners across the region, including former sort of colonial elements of the British Empire, really what kind of engagement they would like to see. What, from their perspective, it's a desirable. And generally speaking, the response has been relatively positive. And I think in part the deterioration of the security environment, particularly in places like the South China Sea and the East China Sea, has made that desirability felt even more strongly than before. Partly also because there is no example or evidence in the last couple of years of continuous deployments, if you want, that the UK would be a reckless presence, or a presence that would sort of operate to willingly destabilize the region. Quite the opposite. So in that sense, if you want, the imperial legacy, which is so difficult, it can be extremely controversial and contested, represented a very important opportunity to critically explore how to engage by asking also partners and counterparts in the region to make sure that their views were part of the policy discourse.
That's great. Thank you. The next question I think is really pertinent. And looking back at my own experience, something that I struggle with preparing to go into the South China Sea. Can you just comment on CSG 21 and the Royal Navy's posture towards gray zone threats, such as the Chinese maritime militia, and how those might be approached?
Okay, that's a great question, and I can see that my good friend Raoul was asking, and you know, as I would expect from him, it's a great question, and it's one of the reasons why I think conceptually the integrated operating concepts, this idea of thinking activities as campaigns, very much comes from a place that, of course, has at heart the experience with Russia, but it naturally speaks to places like the South China Sea and the sort of sub-threshold coercive activities that are taking place in a broader sense. And of course, the OPVs are the ideal assets to engage with it, whether it is by simply sailing and just restating the importance of the maritime order and the frameworks and how they apply in themselves, by being able to respond with presence activities to contestable type of behavior by militias and coast goods, as well as working in capacity building, working in tandem with partners, whether it is in Southeast Asia or other parts indeed of the broader sort of maritime space. That constabulary space, it's a space in which you can approach the problem of what Raoul was calling the gray zone sort of activities in different ways. One way is to push back. But of course, if it happens on the ICs, if it happens, for example, if it happens in territorial waters, I mean, local coastal states would always be at the forefront. But now they can also count on the fact that the UK has a physical presence there that is geared towards managing the classic type of constabulary issues that are at stake there. And that's one side. The other side of that is, as I say, that capacity building. One way is to directly pushing back in support of coastal states. The other way is to helping coastal states to develop their own capacity in order to tackle with these issues. And so it is, and all of this matters because today the institutional knowledge and memory and understanding that the UK has draws a lot on what we hear from our partners and allies and the experience of our ships, and that's not particularly extensive. But once you have a persistent engagement in the region, your understanding will get better, and also try to think about how to help others and keep the environment stable will get better. And here, you know, Captain Hutchinson, please do correct me if I'm wrong, but there is no replacement for direct experience. Once you're there, what you learn from the deck of your ship, it's a completely different take compared to what you learn as a third party hearing from someone else. So I do think that if you want, the shape of the deployment of that forward-leaning presence is in the right place. But what really is going to be interesting is to see how one processes the experience of the next year or 18 months and how that translates into an even better way to engage with our partners.
Yeah, I think that's great. You know, there's a really good question here, and one of the things that I heard consistently on my deployment, and this evidently is going to be our last question. It comes from Renato, who would suggest that it's premature to describe the deployment of CSG 21 as an indication of a re-emergence of British naval power in the East. east of the Suez. And it comes back to that question of persistence. Every one of the allies or whoever I engaged with, or we engaged with in the Asia Pacific, it's really about, you have to be here all the time. You have to demonstrate that you're committed to security and that you're not just here, to flash every once in a while. And the question is one of sustainability. There are still issues, whether or not the UK has the resources and the political will. And of course, that political will can shift with an election to sustain a forward presence in the Indo-Pacific. Do you see the Australia, UK, US playing a role in sustaining UK power projection in the Indo-Pacific region, and how?
Right, so that's an excellent question. There's 3 points in there. One, the political will. The political will, I would be less worried because as the party conferences of both Labour and Conservatives have demonstrated here in the UK, is that there is now a wider consensus of where the Indo-Pacific sits in terms of the priorities of national security. So I would say, regardless of who is in power, a certain continuity and commitment that's going to be there. It might get bigger or smaller, but continuity now, it's no longer a matter of if. I think is now a much sort of more ingrained and consolidated position across the aisle. And if anything, Parliament is absolutely committed to that. So there is an element of that part of the story that I think we can slightly safer in saying it's not going to go away. Now, in terms of sustainability, which is the second part, that's where the deployment of the current assets is very important, because the more logistically demanding assets will be based in DACOM, whereas the OPVs, the way they are designed, they have a much lighter footprint and a much lighter requirement for specific, if you want, docking arrangements, whether it is the manning system of the ships or the ships themselves. And the manning system has already been tested for the last 2 years with HMS Montrose in Bahrain, and it seems to be working. The current sort of outlook suggests that it's been thought about with a keen eye on the matter of sustainability. So point number 2, yes, sustainability is an important point, but it's a point that has been informing the debate over how to guarantee that continuous engagement. And so I think, again, we'll see in 18 months how it goes, but everything looks at the moment as if these ships can actually be serviced in pretty much any dry docks, in any sort of facilities, naval facilities, anywhere. In fact, even civilian facilities, as a matter of fact, for most things. And the third element is specifically how this picture is already changing with AUKUS. And not only AUKUS, because we're going to throw in also the existing debates between Japan and conversations between Japan and the UK, for example, on reciprocal access agreements, right? All of this is going to be really important. In fact, the long-term sustainability will be a lot more sustainable. And indeed, it will allow also to consider a more robust, if you want, presence, however that is defined, depending on how these arrangements evolve. AUKUS in particular, particularly the capabilities gap in the submarine force, raises a very interesting question of the extent to which the UK and US will help filling into that, if you want, capability gap between where the Australians are today and where they're going to be once they start operating their nuclear subs. Also, you have to create a generation of nuclear submariners, so that in itself will demand part of the commitment from the UK and the US, which in turn raises a very interesting question of the opportunities that it creates for stronger sustainability to the UK. Needless to say, already Australia, in the context of the Australia-France agreement, represented a very important point for France and French engagement in the Indo-Pacific. So the fact now that the UK is in a similar position, it really says a lot about what the potential of that pact can deliver in terms of enhancing what already has been a concern that has been thought about and sort of hoovering underneath the integrated review process and the command paper.
Well, thank you, Dr. Patalano, for that. Thank you to all of the people who have submitted questions. I've gone through them while we've been talking, and just brilliant from my perspective. A lot of really good points raised. Unfortunately, we just don't have the time to get to every one of them. We'll see if we can collate them here and how we might be able to address some if we're able to do that. I now turn it over to Brett, with my thanks to the team that has put this together and to Dr. Patalano in particular for taking us through what is a unique opportunity to talk about the UK's part in East Asian security. So, Brett.
Right. Yes. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. Deep thanks to you, Dr. Alessio Patalano, but probably a good thing, as I think my neck is getting sore here from nodding along in agreement with all your points. I strongly recommend to anyone in the audience, if you want these sort of little knowledge nuggets and ongoing observations, I strongly recommend that you follow Alessio on Twitter at Alessio Naval. For like daily nuggets from the Indo-Pacific and beyond. It's just a fantastic treasure trove for anyone. In terms of a future treasure trove, a video of this webinar will be made available on YouTube. You can just search for MSC conference, that's Mike Sierra Charlie conference, and you'll be able to find this video to re-listen to it or the others in our webinar series. Thanks again. Don't go to our Maritime Security Challenges partners for helping to make this happen. I was remiss in neglecting two of our key partners earlier, the Navy League of Canada and the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. Thank you very much to you for helping make this happen. And of course, as always, deep thanks to Lockheed Martin, MBA, General Dynamics, and Cellular Robotics for their support in making this a deep and robust conversation happen. Alessio, thank you very much for taking this time, and I wish you a good night, sir, and a good night, good morning, good evening to all the rest of you. And I hope you will join us again for our next webinar at the beginning of December.
Thank you.
Fair winds and following.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Goodbye now.
Two, one.
At Lockheed Martin, we're on a mission. Your mission. When millions of people are counting on you, you can count on us. To build the impossible, to invent the inconceivable, and solve every problem with speed and reliability. Every mission is an expedition of the greatest importance, both to you and to us.